Thank you very much, Lars. First of all, I really would like to thank you for having invited me. This is a great initiative, and I think it is timely. I'm just back from the ICPS at Amsterdam, and I can tell you 99% of the presentations that I attended were between persons. This is really timely, and I do not exactly know why you invited me. So the intrapersonal evidence we are having, that's pretty preliminary, but anyways, it is exciting to be here. Research in psychology and education in the behavioral sciences more generally pertains to within-person psychological functioning, but most of the empirical studies that are available use parameters that are based on between-person variation. That obviously did not change over the past 50 years since calls for intrapersonal research are out. And the problem with this, and this has been pointed out by Peter and Bernd, is we cannot infer within-person functioning from between-person variation. And one reason is that the interindividual, the intra-individual, that's just one case in point, covariation between variables are statistically independent and can vary widely. This is one of my favorite examples, and in fact this has been provided by Reinhard Schmitz in this JPSP publication. The relation between duration of sleep and the frequency of migraine headaches. What you're having here is a positive relation between persons. So this would suggest that sleeping in leads to headaches, and all you would have to do is waking up and getting up early, but this would be completely misleading. The within-person relations are negative. Short sleep precipitates headaches, and the practical consequences are just very different. So the between and within-person covariation between variables can be non-equivalent. And similar principles hold for experimental studies. That's not an escape in and of itself. Between subject mean effects can mask very different effects for different individuals. So as a general rule, between person, within person parameters for the levels for development for the functions of variables can differ widely, implying that we need theories and empirical studies examining the degree of equivalence for any a given set of variables. And the best way to do this may be really to combine between person and within person approaches. I'm going to talk about some examples from our research on achievement emotions. Achievement emotions are defined simply as emotions related to achievement activities and their success and failure outcomes, making it possible to differentiate between activity and outcome emotions. These are some examples. Test anxiety, which everybody knows. So we know a lot about these vicious cycles of failure, impaired self-confidence, lack of motivation, poor study strategies, and then anxiety before and during the next exam, and then again failure. Anger, there may be different variants of anger, achievement-related. Despair, I'm drinking this substance here because I failed my math exam, a test of the German language capabilities. Boredom, on an average, students free board 32% of classroom instruction time. This may be boredom. This may be boredom. Positive emotions, joy after the exam is over. Pride. Relaxation and relief after the work is done. So I'm going to talk about some of these emotions in terms of interindividual and intra-individual perspectives. I'm going to focus on three issues, developmental trajectories, functions of emotions for motivation and performance, on their origins in terms of students' appraisals and achievement goals. And I will use the control value theory of achievement emotions as a theoretical framework. The control value theory would propose that the process parameters of emotions, such as frequency, intensity, decay time, and so on, can differ between domains, genders, contexts, individuals, whereas the functional relations in terms of outcomes and origins are proposed to be universal, and that may be a naive proposition, but I would state it makes sense to start with such a proposition. Implying that they should be equivalent between within individuals and also across different individuals. We tested this proposition for different academic domains and found, for example, that the levels of emotions can vary across domains such as math versus languages, but the relations with achievement were similar across domains. We tested it for genders, For example, we found the levels of math emotions varied between the female and male students, but the relations with control and value repressors were pretty similar. And we also tested it for cultural context, so the levels of emotions drastically different, for example, between Chinese and German students, but the relations with appraisals, parental expectations were pretty similar. And the examples I'm going to show, I'm going to extend this for the issue of between versus within individuals. First issue, development. So the theory would state this can differ across individuals, and we tested this assumption using data from a diary study of student-teachers' emotions that they experienced before and during their final university exams, 72 students over 42 days. And what you see here is the average development of test anxiety. And what you see is the average level of test anxiety increases until the first exam day and then decreases. You could take that for granted. So that's how test anxiety should develop, in an exam context. But if you look into the individual trajectories, and we have seen that before in the prior talks, it looks like this. So any kinds of levels and shapes. And if you take 3 examples, so this student here, flat line, reports no anxiety except in the very first beginning, a bit of anxiety, a bit of nervousness, but then down again. This student here, increasing level until during the middle of the exam period and then down to a low level. This student here, high levels, then goes down but up again at the end. Very different trajectories. Hope, a flat line, on an average, nothing happens, and different trajectories again for different students. And these are 3 examples displaying 3 different individual trajectories. So the conclusion would be the developmental trajectories vary widely across individuals. Parameters based on the interindividual distribution in terms of mean development are essentially meaningless, which implies that for developmental issues between and within person parameters are just not equivalent, at least in this data set. Second issue, functions for motivation and performance. Considering the functions of emotions, makes sense to use 2 traditional dimensions describing human affect to group emotions: valence, positive versus negative, and activation, activating, deactivating. And to make things simple, if you just bifurcate both dimensions, you get 4 simple groups of emotions: positive activating, enjoyment, hope, pride; positive deactivating, such as relief and relaxation; a negative activating, for example, anger, anxiety, shame; negative deactivating, hopelessness, boredom. And we would assume that emotions of these 4 groups impact learning and performance via a number of different cognitive and motivational mechanisms, including the availability of cognitive resources, students' motivation to learn, processes of the storage and retrieval of information, and use of learning strategies. And we would assume, for example, that positive activating emotions should focus attention on the task at hand and preserve cognitive resources, should promote different types of motivation, should facilitate relational information processing and the use of flexible learning strategies and self-regulation. So under most conditions, in most individuals, we would assume the effects should be positive. The opposite should be true for deactivating negative emotions such as boredom. Boredom depletes cognitive resources. You start daydreaming when you are bored, undermines any kind of motivation, undermines systematic information processing and systematic use of learning strategies. For the middle 2 categories, things may be a bit more complex. For example, let's take the activating negative emotion, anxiety. Anxiety can also deplete cognitive resources. You start worrying about possible failure. It undermines intrinsic motivation and interest, but on the other hand, as most of us know, it can produce strong motivation to invest effort in order to avoid failure, and it could also facilitate a more item-specific and rigid way of dealing with learning information. So overall, for positive activating, negative deactivating emotions, we would propose that the effects typically are positive and versus negative respectively, and for the middle 2 categories just more variable. Most of the evidence we have gathered so far is, I have to admit that, I'm guilty of having conducted between-person studies. So these are some examples. We did experimental studies using affective states and then looking into their effects on cognitive resources, problem-solving strategies, memory processes, and so on. And we also conducted field studies looking into the linkages of emotions, motivation, learning strategies, achievement over time. I show you just one example. This is a longitudinal study in the domain of mathematics, a project for the analysis of learning and achievement in mathematics. From grades 5 to 10, the longitudinal study comprised 3,500 students, and we used this data from this study to test a simple reciprocal effects model for emotion and achievement, implying that the two reciprocally influence each other over time. These are the emotions that were included: mathematics, achievement, and a couple of covariates. And then we did cross-legged structure equation modeling. This was the basic structure. So what we are having here is achievement as a manifest variable, emotion as a latent variable, a number of covariates. We do have a pre-existing relationship between emotion and achievement in grade 5, and we do have then incremental effects of emotion on achievement over time and of achievement on emotion over time. And these are the findings for enjoyment, so pre-existing positive relationship and incremental positive effects of enjoyment on achievement, and reciprocal effects of achievement on enjoyment goes on like that, so positive feedback loops. Peter.
Quick question. Do you allow also contemporaneous relationships between
Yeah.
NIRE
Yeah. Anxiety, positive feedback loops as well, but here it's about negative effects, negative pre-existing relationship, negative effect of anxiety on achievement, negative effect of achievement on anxiety goes on like this, and hopelessness, similar picture here, negative pre-existing relations stemming from elementary school, and then feedback loops between the two variables. So we would conclude that individual differences in emotions are linked to differences in achievement over time and vice versa. So overall, it's reciprocal links. But what about intra-individual relations between these two variables? We got two, no more than that. Within-person studies I can talk about. One is a diary study, and the diary study I talked about previously in terms of mean developments. We did have exam-related trait variables and state variables in this diary study, and we used the trait variables to examine interindividual covariation and the state variables to examine intra-individual covariation. And the second one is a qualitative interview study. We interviewed 56 student teachers after their final university exams in psychology and asked them, how did you feel during the exam? What were your thoughts during the exam? We did that right after the exam. So this is about the measures. So on a trait level, we measured, in addition to emotions, different types of motivation, including intrinsic motivation. I invest effort because I'm interested. Failure avoidance motivation, I invest effort because I want to avoid getting poor grades. And total motivation and intra-individually state emotions and motivation in terms of enjoyment, anxiety, boredom, and total motivation to learn. On that day, today, I'm very motivated to learn. What we find is this pattern of correlations. So what you see is the between a person correlations between enjoyment on the one hand and intrinsic motivation on the other hand is positive, and the correlation with total motivation is positive as well. And the mean intra-individual correlation between enjoyment and total motivation also is positive. So equivalence between and average within. For boredom, negative link with intrinsic motivation, negative link with total motivation inter-individually and also intra-individually. For anxiety, the situation is more complex. So we do have a negative link with intrinsic motivation, a positive link with failure avoidance motivation, and a zero mean intra-individual correlation between the two variables. Now, beyond these findings, we also find on an intra-individual level that the intra-individual relations between enjoyment, boredom on the one hand, and motivation on the other are equivalent across individuals, whereas for anxiety it's more complex. I'll show you examples. So this is a distribution of intra-individual correlations between students' enjoyment, daily enjoyment, and their daily motivation to prepare. And what you see is here two exceptions, 0 and slightly negative, and all the other correlations are positive. So there's some degree of equivalence across individuals. For boredom, this was a similar picture, and this is findings from the interview study. In the interview study, we also asked this question: what has this feeling motivated you to do? What would you have liked to do? And answers were: the boredom caused the feeling of dissatisfaction, lack of motivation. You are bored, lose the motivation. I'd rather leave and postpone the task, could no longer sit in my chair, just wanted to get away, drifted away mentally, thought of something else, daydream, tired, bad posture, yawning. So uniformly negative effect from the subjective perspective. For anxiety, the situation is much different. What you have here, again, is the distribution of intra-individual correlations. What you see is some of them are negative, many are 0, but some of them are positive. So you get any kinds of covariation between the two variables across different individuals. And this is then just, again, juxtaposing the interviews. What has this feeling motivated you to do? Anxiety related to the exam. I'd rather have avoided the exam, no motivation anymore, wanted it to be over. The feeling has prompted me to pray the days before, even to weep. I just wanted it to be over, or that I haven't to do it in the first place. I'd rather have done anything else instead of sitting there and studying. So that's one side of the picture. And the other one is I want to pass it. I don't want to fail the exam. I have to manage to finish it. I wanted to do on the test as well as possible. It has anxiety has motivated me to see the exam as a challenge. And when one student put it into one sentence, you would rather run away, but on the other hand, you want to fulfill your obligations over really ambiguous feelings. And so these different mechanisms may be balanced differently in different individuals, and may be therefore we get different correlations in different individuals. We do not yet have these analyzed these data in terms of processes over time, how the covariation develops in time series. So conclusions: activating positive emotion enjoyment, deactivating negative boredom, equivalence across individuals, and also within and between. For anxiety, the situation is more complex. Finally, origins in terms of appraisals and achievement goals. Propositions of different theories on the origins of emotions are complementary, fortunately, rather than mutually exclusive. The control value theory aims to integrate the proposition of different theories on achievement emotions. It also makes an attempt to expand propositions of previous theories in terms of addressing not only outcome emotions that were the focus in existing theories, but also activity emotions related to achievement activities. The basic propositions pertain to the appraisal antecedents of achievement emotions and have a number of implications for the domain specificity of these emotions, their individual and social antecedents, reciprocal causation, treatment of achievement emotions, relative universality. I'm going to talk about two issues: appraisals and achievement goals as individual antecedents. For appraisals, again, we have between-person studies at this point of time only. Theory first: there are many factors that are known to contribute to the arousal of emotions: genetic, epigenetic dispositions, conditioning processes, and so on. So for phylogenetically old and constrained situations, there may be a primacy of biologically prepared emotion schemata in conditioning processes, implying that appraisals would be less important. But for settings shaped by cultural evolution, there's a need to interpret the situation to adapt to culturally defined demands, implying that appraisals are necessary for adaptive thought, emotion, and action. And this then, I would say, implies that for achievement settings and achievement emotions, appraisals likely are important. The control value theory proposes that it's two groups of appraisals that are especially relevant: appraisals of control over achievement activities and their outcomes in terms of causal expectancies and attributions, as well as competence appraisals, and appraisals of the value of these activities, the importance of these activities and outcomes, and different types and combinations of these appraisals are thought to influence different types of achievement emotions. For example, causal expectancies, prospective emotions, retrospective attributions, retrospective emotions, competence appraisals, activity emotions. It also is proposed that these appraisals interact in basically multiplicative ways. So for example, a student would be assumed to enjoy learning if two conditions are met: if the student feels competent to master the task, and if he or she is interested and values learning. And if perceived competence is too low or with no interest, learning should not be enjoyable. Anxiety of failure should be high when control is lacking, coupled with high importance of the exam, for example, and low when everything is under control, or when you just do not care, there is no need to be anxious. I show you two sets of findings testing these assumptions. One is experimental, the other one correlational. Experimental evidence from a test-taking study. So what we did was we announced to participants they would take a test, show them a sample item, 19, 16, 13, 10, 7, what's the next element here among these options, and then we asked them, how do you feel right now before taking this test? Low control, the sample item was not solvable. High control, it was very easy. Low value, these are number riddles, there are no consequences whatsoever, your performance is not assessed. High value, this is a math test counting towards your final grade. It was high school students. And what we find, and this is then questions derived from the achievement emotions questionnaire that we asked. After having shown the sample item, how would you feel? I'm nervous because I could fail. I worry I could do poorly, and so on. And what we find is, under conditions of high control, easy item, anxiety scores are relatively low. Under conditions of lack of control, unsolvable sample item, but coupled with, this is just number riddles, anxiety scores are low. It's the combination of lack of control and high importance that boosts anxiety scores. Correlation example from a field study on achievement emotions secondary school students. We measured self-concept of ability as a proxy for control, the perceived importance of success and failure as a measure of value, and used latent interaction analysis to look into the main effects of control and value, as well as the effects of the interaction between the two variables on these 5 emotions here. And what we found was control is having positive effects within this model on enjoyment and pride, negative effects on anger, anxiety, and shame. Value, the importance of achievement, is having positive effects on all of these emotions. Value is an amplifier for emotions. But above and beyond these main effects, the interaction also is having effects, except for pride. And you see here how this interaction looks like. So this is for enjoyment as the dependent variable, and you see that control is having a positive effect on enjoyment, and this positive effect is relatively weak if value is low, and it's considerably, the regression line is considerably steeper if value is high, and enjoyment is most pronounced, the combination of high control and high value. Conversely, for anxiety, a negative effect of control on anxiety, this effect is relatively weak if achievement is not very important. With high importance, the effect is much stronger, and anxiety is most pronounced when a lack of control is coupled with high value. Now, all of this is between persons. Okay. For achievement goals as antecedents, we do have a data set that directly contrasts the interindividual and the intra-individual perspective. From a theory perspective, we would assume appraisals are the proximal determinants of achievement emotions, implying that achievement goals and other individual determinants should impact emotions by impacting appraisals in the first place. More specifically, we propose that mastery approach goals focus students' attention on the controllability and positive values of achievement activities, thereby promoting enjoyment and reducing anger and boredom. Performance approach goals should focus attention on the controllability and positive values of success outcomes, thereby promoting positive outcome emotions such as hope and pride. And performance avoidance goals focus attention on the uncontrollability and negative values of failure outcomes, thereby promoting anxiety and shame. We use data from an experience sampling study of 120 students to test these assumptions, both from an interindividual and from an intra-individual perspective. Inter-individual, this was about trait measures of achievement goals and emotions, and intra-individual state measures of achievement goals and emotions in multiple experience sampling occasions within each individual student. So, for example, trait achievement goals, my goal in math is to perform better than the other students. That's from Andy Elliott's achievement goal questionnaire. State achievement goals, my goal at this moment is to perform better than the other students, and the item wording was equivalent across trait and state measures. We used just multiple regression analysis for the trait measures and multi-level modeling for the state measures, with level 1 being within the students. And what we find is this is the inter-individual relationships between goals and emotions on the trait level. And what we see is mastery goals are positive predictors of enjoyment, negative predictors of anger and boredom. Performance approach, positive predictor of pride. Performance avoidance, a positive predictor of anxiety and shame. And there are some other linkages here as well. But these are the theoretically proposed relations between these variables. That's the inter-individual. And now if you look into the intra-individual, it's exactly the same pattern. So I was afraid of seeing these findings because we had proposed this model, and the intra-individual might have completely different from what we have postulated before. But what you see here is on the intra-individual level, mastery goals, positive predictor of enjoyment, negative anger and boredom. Performance approach, positive pride. Performance avoidance, positive anxiety and shame. Now, this to an extent is striking. Why this equivalent? And I mean, I must say, these are mean relationships. Averaged, never average, where's Bernd? Never average across individuals, but still, I mean, why this equivalence? One possibility may look like this. A specific trait goal orientation may predispose an individual to adopt a specific state goal in a suitable context. It might also predispose an individual to select and create a suitable context. The state goal then would be able to trigger related state emotions, and these state emotions could reinforce the respective trait emotions. And if you would conceptualize trait emotions as abstract dispositions, it would just be a conceptual relationship. If you would conceptualize trait emotions as concrete dispositions, it might be a factual relationship, which would imply that these within-person functional relationship here over time then creates an inter-individual relation between the related trait variables. These are two hypothetical examples. Trait mastery approach goals in a challenging learning situation could let students adopt state mastery approach goals that in turn then facilitate enjoyment of learning, which could reinforce trait enjoyment related to such a context. Threatening exam situations, trait performance avoidance orientation in such a situation would lead to the adoption of state performance avoidance goals, which then would facilitate anxiety, which over time, if it recurs, would reinforce the respective dispositional variable. Conclusions. Development trajectories vary widely across individuals. No equivalence of parameters between and within and across individuals. For relations with motivation to learn, in German and boredom, the between and with average within relations are equivalent, and the relations are also equivalent, not in terms of strength, but in terms of the sign, the direction of the relationship across individuals. And for anxiety, just the more complex pattern that I explained. And for relations with achievement goals, mastery goals predict activity emotions, performance goals, outcome emotions, and we find the same pattern for between person relations and average within person relations. And we still have to test that if that can be generalized to what I said, that can be generalized across individual students. So these are findings, and all the other findings shown by Peter and Bernd that imply that we need to integrate interindividual and intra-individual perspectives. And this also is true for research on affect and motivation in the field of education. We need theories, not only empirical evidence, we also, I think, need strong theories telling us under what conditions would inter and intra-individual relations converge, and under what conditions would they diverge, and in what ways, and for what groups of students, and what would be the moderators. And we also obviously need appropriate methodologies such as intra-individual instruction, equation modeling, then being integrated across individuals. I would like to thank all those who helped me in doing this research. So this is the group of current doctoral students in Munich. Christoph left Munich. He now is at the University of Regensburg. These are some of our cooperation partners in Germany and Europe. One of them in England, Ko Murayama, who just had to leave because he has to teach courses at the University of Reading this afternoon. He was here. And Anne Frenzel, Thomas Götz, Ulrich Trautwein. And in other continents, North America, Andy Elliott, Ray Perry, Krista Lewis, Lisa Lindenbrink, Australia, Herb Marsh. Thanks for your attention.